About a year and a half ago, I read The Lord of the Rings and commented on it from the perspective of someone who is a specialist in the Old Norse language and the mythology preserved in it. That was medium well received, maybe, and I've continued on my Patreon page to do a commentary on the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, a work that is even more clearly influenced and impacted by Norse, but also Finnish mythology. Now, there is quite a difference between Norse and Finnish mythology, beginning with the fact that the Finnish language is not, in fact, related to the languages that we otherwise call Scandinavian. Finnish is a member of the Uralic language family. It is ultimately distantly related to Hungarian and some languages of Siberia, as well as the Sami languages of further north Scandinavia. It's also quite closely related to Estonian. But these languages are not, so far as scholars can establish, part of the same ultimate ancestry as the Indo-European languages that include English and the Scandinavian languages. And in the Middle Ages, while there was quite a bit of contact between people speaking Old Norse and the ancestor of Finnish, to the point that Finnish has absorbed loanwords from all the way at the beginning, Proto-Germanic times, all the way through, of course, modern Swedish and English. There's still quite a difference in the stories that are being told by these different language groups, although I think that you can see influence both ways. For example, I've long suspected that the story of the death of Baldur is influenced by a Finnish story. Now, Finnish mythology is best known through the lens of Kalevala, the work of Elias Lönnrot, a 19th century writer who put together something of a coherent picture of Finnish myth based on traditional songs and poems that he heard traveling Finland and Karelia. This is not necessarily a definitive ancient or medieval source for Finnish myth, but it's a compendium of sort of an ideal form of what these myths might look like. You might think of him, Elias Lönnrot is to 19th century Finland what Snorri Sturluson is to 13th century Iceland. He's a figure that stands at the end of an oral tradition and tries to make something that is intelligible for a new written tradition that's establishing itself around him and that he is more himself a part of. I think that's a fair enough way of putting this. Now, as I often identify myself at the beginning of videos, I'm an Old Norse specialist, not a Finnish specialist. I have some reading knowledge of Finnish. I have not been able to read Kalevala myself thoroughly in Finnish. What I recommend is the Keith Bosley translation of Kalevala into English. It's different from my translation philosophy. Of course, I'm an Old Norse translator. I've translated the Poetic Edda, among other works from Old Norse. But I think that it's very good, and I like to keep the Finnish sort of open next to it where I can check and see what words are being translated by what, and get a sense of what the original says as well, even though I don't read Finnish well enough to just sit down and sort of casually enjoy it in that language. But what inspired this video is in my Silmarillion readings for Patreon, I got to the story of Turin Turambar, which is really, in a lot of ways, I think fair to call a rewriting of a story from the Kalevala, which is the story of Kullervo, son of Kullervo, and mixed with the story of Sigurður, the dragon slayer, which is told in the second half of the Poetic Edda, as well as in the bulk of the saga of the Volsungs. So what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about the story of Kullervo. Again, there are specialists in Finnish language and Finnish literature who could give you a more in-depth deep dive, but I want to look at it from the perspective of an Old Norse scholar who knows enough about Finnish, I think, to give this a fair shake, and also compare it to what Tolkien does in his Turambar story. Hey folks, we'll be back to your regular presentation in a moment, but for right now, I'm here at Grimfrost World Headquarters Longhouse with Johan Hegg, and I just want to remind you that if you have Viking needs, you have a Viking supplier. Grimfrost really cares about getting things right, and if you need replica, well, anything, right? Shields, helmets, weapons, board games, cool t-shirts, hats, all sorts of accessories like that. You can get them at grimfrost.com together with my books, and they ship just about anywhere in the world. So check them out. It does help support the channel. So, Kullervo, his story is told in the sections, the individual poems of Kalevala, which each one is called a runo. That word may in fact be ultimately borrowed from the word that gives us Old Norse rune and etc. Although its meaning in Finnish is like song or poem, it's not a rune, like a rune letter. And anyway, his story is told in runos 31 to 36. Now, Kullervo, son of Kullervo, let me pull out my notes here, which are actually in my copy of the Silmarillion to make sure that I'm not going to tell you anything wrong, because I've just re-reviewed this and comparing the Finnish and Bosley's English and then a Swedish translation that's on Heimskringla.no. I think I've largely understood the story, although every time I read it I realize there's something new about it that I hadn't picked up the first time. That's always how it is with myth, right? So Kullervo, son of Kullervo, Kullervon poika, his uncle Untamo, or Untamoinen, wages war against his father Kullervo, so Untamo's brother, after what, as I understand it, is a dispute about fishing. It doesn't really become clear why these two fishermen have armies they can array against one another, but Untamo fully destroys the forces of his brother Kullervo, leaving, at the beginning of the story, so far as we know, only a woman alive, but the woman is pregnant. Women often don't get names in these stories. I don't believe she's given a name. And she gives birth to a son who is given the name Kullervo. Now his uncle Untamo decides to raise him, even though he perceives that the fate of his family lies in Kullervo's hands. As he says in the original Finnish, Tästessä sukuni surma. Their death takes hold of my family, if I'm not translating that wrong. Often in Bosley's translation, you will see the Finnish word surma, violent death, translated as doom. Don't let that distract you if you're reading J.R.R. Tolkien's work as well and looking for sort of similar language. Tolkien uses doom in the sense of judgment, fate, but Bosley is translating always this death word with it. So in fact, it's fairly different what doom means if you're reading the Turambar story versus if you're reading the Kalevala translation that I recommend. Anyway, he sets Kullervo different jobs to do, but Kullervo is doomed in the normal sense of this in English. He can't do anything well. He's given a baby to take care of and he kills the baby. He's assigned to be a woodsman and he ruins the forest. He just can't do anything well. And so Untamo, in the next runo, runo 32, sells him to the, actually I guess at the end of runo 31, he sells him to Ilmarinen, the smith god, and in runo 32, and he sells him for nothing, right, for just trash, and he accepts some broken pots and tools in exchange for him. In runo 32, Ilmarinen's wife assigns Kullervo the job of being their cowboy, watching over her herd of cattle. And much of runo 32 consists of this extremely long traditional poem cursing anyone who will bring harm upon these cattle. Well, in Runo 33, it is Kullervo himself who decides to avenge himself by bringing harm upon these cattle. He is upset when this loaf of bread that Ilmarinen's wife has baked for him turns out to contain a rock in it, and he breaks his knife on it, trying to cut open this measly loaf of bread. Now, that knife is the only thing that he's inherited from his family, who he thinks are all dead, and so he's furious and decides he's going to get his revenge. And he drowns all of the cattle in a bog, and then he drives a herd of wolves and bears somehow back to the yards, the farm enclosure, what we would call the Gardar in Old Norse, of Ilmarinen's wife, and then convinces her to come milk the cows. She admires their hides, apparently not realizing that they are bears and wolves, and tries to milk one, and they maul her to death. So then Kullervo flees, and on his way, he's desperate and alone, but he meets an old woman who tells him that, in fact, your family is not dead. Your parents survive, as do 2 sisters and a brother, and I can tell you how to reach them. It's a long way to the northwest. You'll have to spend days walking. She gives him some long, very complicated directions, but he follows these directions and he comes to his parents' home. They are, in fact, still alive. His father and mother are there, as are his brother and 1 sister. The only one who's missing is a sister who has wandered away and become lost and is presumed dead. Now, this is where we really get close to the story of Turin Turambar, because in Runo 35, Kullervo is going to go into the forest, and he is going to meet 3 young women in a row, and each one he's going to try to entice to ride with him in his sleigh. And the first 2 curse him and tell him, I'm not going to lie down in your sleigh. May death lie down in your sleigh, right? They curse him in a truly medieval, old-fashioned sense, right? They're wishing ill upon him that their words might bring to pass. But he comes to a 3rd lovely young woman who curses him a similar way, but now he's tired of it, and this one he just chooses to abduct and pull into his sleigh. And once he has her within his power, he shows her all of his wealth. He has wonderful gold and silver and jewels, and this persuades her that maybe he's okay. I mean, I'm just the messenger of the story. I know this is misogynistic, but just telling you how it reads. It's my responsibility to you. And they sleep together that night, and the next morning he gets up and he says, "Oh, so, I'm Kullervo, son of Kullervo. Who are you?" And she says, "I'm the daughter of Kullervo. I wandered away from home. I got distracted picking berries for 3 days, and I found myself at the end of 3 days far from home, and I went up on a high hill, and I looked back toward my home, and I couldn't see it, and I called out, and the forest itself told me that my parents would never hear me, and I've been lost ever since." By the way, that trope of things talking, right? Forests talk. Later in the story, a sword talks, is quite common in Finnish myth, and is one of the tropes that I think is transferred to Norse myth in the story of Balder. Well, now that she realizes that she slept with her brother, she throws herself into a river to kill herself. And of course, now Kullervo is all the more upset. He goes home and he tells his family what's happened to their daughter and sister. And he says, "Now, if I die, will any of you miss me?" And each one in turn, his other sister, his father, and his brother say, "We won't miss you at all. We won't mourn for you." But finally, his mother says, "Well, I alone will mourn for you. I'll weep so much that I'll flood this house if you were lost." Which, there's a lot of actually pretty gripping, always negative, always sorrowful, always mournful emotion in Finnish myth, something that I think you don't see always quite so clearly in Norse myth, although you see it, for example, in a very old poem in the Poetic Edda, like Gudrun or Kvitha 1, the first poem of Gudrun. Well, Kullervo blames his sister's death and the rest of his misfortune on his uncle Untamo and decides to go and get his revenge. He asks Ukko, the highest god, for a sword, and he's granted one. The sword doesn't have a name like it does in the story of Turin Turambar or Sigurd's sword in the Volsung's Grammar. But he goes and slays Untamo and the rest of his people, and finally he asks the sword, "Would you be willing to kill me?" And the sword tells him, I'm going to just read you this in Bosley's translation because I think that it's pretty rock and roll toward the end of Runo 36. "Why should I not eat what I like, not eat guilty flesh, not drink blood that is to blame? I'll eat even guiltless flesh, I'll drink even blameless blood." Right, so it's a very real thing for a sword to say, like, yeah, hey, you've used me to kill innocents, I'll kill you, man, you're guilty. And so ends Turin Turambar, and Runo 36 of the Kalevala ends with a note about how much grief is caused to and by parentless children. So again, it gets pretty real, right? Finnish myth gets very tragic in a way that I think is easily appreciable by a modern readership. Like very personally tragic, right? Norse myth is tragic too. The ultimate tragedy is Ragnarok, but you get these personal, very sad stories like this. So the story of Turin Turambar in the Silmarillion, or published on its own as The Children of Húrin, of course, is remarkably dependent on this. And I'll get into my comments on the full read-through of Turin for Patreon. But the main thing, of course, well, some of the most serious themes that are adjusted are from Tolkien's own imagination. Turin's father, is aware of what's happening because Melkor Morgoth has cursed him to actually perceive all of the tragic happenings to his family. So that's quite an adaptation. Turin slays the dragon Glaurung in much the same fashion as Sigurdur in the Volsung story slays the dragon Fafnir, waiting underneath him on the path that he treads down to water to stab him from beneath, although he doesn't have as long of a conversation in the Silmarillion as Sigurdur has with Fafnir that actually dominates the action of the dragon slaying story in the Norse source. And of course, it's the dragon that curses the sister to not recognize her brother in the Silmarillion version, whereas in the Finnish version of this story, the brother and sister have never met, so it's a little more understandable. They don't realize that they're siblings. You don't need the magical intervention. But this story must in some way have spoken to J.R.R. Tolkien, and I wonder what exactly inspired him to combine the stories of Sigurdur and Kullervo into the Turin story. I suppose he perhaps saw in them two great mythic heroes who were fatherless, or perceived themselves as fatherless. Sigurdur's father is killed when his mother is pregnant with him, and the same with Kullervo believes that of his father until he later meets his father. They both have rivalries with family members. Well, both the Volsung story and the Kullervo story involve that. The rivalry with the family member is actually more Sigurdur's father, Sigmundur, who fights his brother-in-law. And of course, in both the Volsung story and the Kullervo story, there is a brother who sleeps with his sister. Kullervo with his sister, who by the way is unnamed. Again, these Finnish stories often don't name the women. And Sigmundur, Sigurdur's father, sleeps with his sister Signy. So perhaps he saw these common elements there and decided that there was something in it that inspired him to combine them and make of them one tale, which is effectively what he does in the story of Turin Turambar in the Silmarillion, or in The Children of Húrin, an expanded version of that story published in a standalone volume. Well, I hope for scholars of Finnish that that's been a fair condensation of that story from, again, an Old Norse guy's perspective. I would be happy to get more scholars of Finnish and Finnic on here. I've had a few. Johan Schelling came and talked about Germanic borrowings into Finnic languages. That was a fascinating talk. I've had Kendra Wilson come and talk about runic inscriptions in Finland, but not too much talk about Finnish and Finnic itself. Well, I did talk while I was in Finland in one video about the Finnish language and in one video about the Estonian language. Be happy to get knowledgeable people and scholars on here to talk more about these subjects. I think that people who are interested in Old Norse are often interested in Finland as well. There's, like I said, a lot of cultural and linguistic interchange there. So scholars in that field, if you have something interesting you'd like to say to a wider public, let me know. We can talk about scheduling an interview. And in the meantime, I appreciate those of you out there checking out my translations from Old Norse, especially if you're getting them from my good friends at Grimfrost, or perhaps ordering signed copies from my good friends at Boulder Bookstore. Those are shippable to the USA, Canada, and Australia. You can order one today. And thank you to Patreon for your continued support. And everyone out there from beautiful free Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.